Hello, this is Mike Rosenberg from IESE Business School with another of our series of webinars on trying to help managers deal with and manage their way through this coronavirus. If you haven't been watching our series, I'm a strategy professor at IESE Business School, and really this is our way of reaching out to different people and doing what we can to help. IESE Business School has about 50,000 alumni all over the world, but we decided early on to open this up to everyone. And you can watch this, of course, on the LinkedIn channel that you're on right now. And then the tape of this broadcast will also be available on LinkedIn on the IESE Business School website, as well as La Vanguardia, which is a newspaper here in Barcelona, and some other places. Today, it's a pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague Nuno Fernandes. Nuno is a finance professor at IESE Business School. Nuno has been um, a professor in this field for many years. He spent 10 years at another business school called IMD after finishing his doctoral work with us at IESE. He's the chairman of the audit committee for the Central Bank of Portugal. He was the dean of the Católica Lisbon Business School for the last 3 years. He is a regular contributor to the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's also the author of one of the best textbooks in finance for business, which is called Finance for Executives, which is a very original title, I think. His new book is called The Value Killers, which is all about how to avoid destroying value during mergers and acquisitions. Nuno, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the series.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the invitation, and thank you very much for the super kind introduction. My mom would be so proud of me now.
Nuno, you wrote a book called Value Killers. I mean, talking about value killers, this crisis seems to be the biggest value killer many of us have ever seen. How is this crisis different from other crises, from SARS or from the meltdown in 2009, 2010?
Yeah, I mean, Mike, I think this is really a once in a lifetime crisis. And I think we often say this, and we said this also in the 2008 financial crisis. But I fear that this is actually probably the worst crisis that we're going to live, anyone that is currently living. And I think all the comparisons with the 2008 financial crisis or SARS back in 2003 are not valid, right? There's one thing I want to start by saying, which is in this crisis in particular, and I think this is very obvious to everybody now, is that mortality rates are not correlated with the economic impact. So it doesn't matter how many people are dying or not. That's not really the ultimate economic impact, right? It's really, there is a huge economic impact that is independent of the health aspect of this crisis. Of course, the health aspect and the mortality is huge from a family point of view, lots of people affected. So that's a drama that exists, but the economic impact of the crisis goes way beyond that. And I summarize here in this report. It's long, but here I give you a quick summary of why I think this is different from other crises. Okay, first, it's global. It's not like the 2008 financial crisis was a U.S. started crisis. It started with subprime in the U.S. that eventually had some spillovers coming to Europe and some other parts of the world. It was not a global crisis. SARS was not a global crisis. The Mexican peso crisis was not a global crisis. It's not focused on any particular country. It did not start in the financial sector as many of the other crises. And the world is also much more integrated now. So this is also generating spillover effects through supply chains that I know we discussed in previous webinars here at IESE. But it's really the spillover effect through supply chains is also quite important. And finally, another thing that is very different is that interest rates are at historical lows. So we never had such low interest rates, actually negative interest rates in many countries around the world. And
Nuno, the link between low interest rates, if I understand your report correctly, and by the way, I forgot to mention, Nuno just published a fantastic report on the crisis, which is available on the IESE Business School website, as well as in other channels. But in your report, if I understand it well, the reason that low interest rates is important is it gives central banks less room to maneuver, less, I think, ammunition is the word you use in the report.
Exactly, exactly. So interest rates are one of the key variables that central banks have at their disposal to either boost or contract economic activity. And typically, as economic activity is booming, central banks raise interest rates to try to calm a little bit so that we don't boil too much the water. And when the water is getting too cold, they put some heat on by lowering the interest rates. The thing is that we have been booming over the last 10 years with zero interest rates. So now basically the ammunition to that we could give now to the economy by lowering interest rates, it was used. So in my opinion, this was a mistake, and I wrote it several times in the last 3 years at least, that it was a mistake to keep the interest rate policies as we had, because in booming periods we needed to watch out for possible crises in the future. And let me just show you a picture that shows the role of China. That is super different. When people talk about SARS, I think SARS was back in 2002, 2003. At that moment in time, China was about 2-3% of world GDP and accounted. So this picture, you have the exports of China in the world. So it's like the market share of China exports in the world. On the left hand side, you have the value of the exports in trillion of dollars. And on the right, you have the share of global exports. And what you can see is that back in the early 2000s, China accounted for maybe 4 or 5% of the world export market. Now it's 3 or 4 times larger than that. Also, money being printed, this is what we were talking about central banks. I mean, the amount of injection of money from central banks over the last decade, in particular after the 2008 financial crisis, I think also makes this crisis a very different one, because we have just injected so much liquidity into the system up until now. This never happened in the past. We never had a crisis happening when liquidity was basically flooding the market and interest rates were so low.
So there's a lot of money, interest rates are so low, we have this disruption, and you think this time it's going to be significantly different. Is it going to impact some parts of the economy more than others? I mean, I don't want to use the word winners and losers in this topic, because I don't think anybody's really winning. But clearly the impact will be different in some sectors of the economy. You know, restaurants, travel, the cruise line business, etc. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think winners. It's very difficult to find a winner, indeed, right? But there are losers and losers, right? And I think if you look around cities around the world, I mean, cities are basically empty, right? In China, in Europe, in the US, in Latin America, this is Quito, this is New York. I mean, basically cities are empty, and this is happening all over the world. If you look at different companies, okay, what has been coming out in recent weeks is basically, I mean, big companies like Volkswagen, car manufacturers, they just suspended production all over Europe, right? The big tourist destinations are empty. All trade fairs have been canceled, events are canceled, including, as we know, the Olympics last week. I mean, all public gatherings.
The Olympics have been postponed, right? I mean, this is like the famous quote from when Muhammad Ali was going to fight George Foreman, and George Foreman broke his hand before the big fight in Zaire. And Don King, his promoter, said that the fight isn't delayed, the fight is rescheduled. So the Olympics have not been delayed; they've been rescheduled to next year. I think is that correct?
That's correct. That's what has happened. The Olympics have been rescheduled for next year. So, which from a Japanese point of view means it's not a total disaster. They will still happen, and they will happen next year. But if you think about some other events, like in Barcelona, right, where the headquarters, where you're sitting right now, the big trade fair of telecommunications and technology that happens early, it was simply canceled, right? So maybe next year there will be another one. The biggest car show in Europe, which is in Geneva, was canceled. Yeah, next year there may be another one, but these are billions and billions that are simply wiped out with these cancellations. And you mentioned cruise operators. Yeah, that's really basically canceled all their activities.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that some industries are looking at, and I think the trade fair business is one of them, is, will people get accustomed to not going to trade fairs? Will they find another way to talk to each other? And if everything is just postponed till next year, or postponed to June, or postponed to whenever, that is clearly a blip. But if this causes fundamental changes in the way people behave and the kind of things people do, then that's going to change the world.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I agree with you, Mike. And I think when we look at financial markets, I'll show you now a few of the pictures from that report that look at financial markets. You see, basically the last 4 years of the S&P performance were wiped out during the month of March. We basically wiped out the whole stock market return from the last 4 years. Although it rebounded a bit over this week, but it's still at 2017 levels. And all over the world, right? This is not just US, it's all over the world. This is just showing you a few of the global stock market performances. It goes from UK to Japan with US, Portugal, Netherlands, Germany, Spain in the middle. And what is being even more worrisome, right? And this is that the volatility. So this picture here shows what's sometimes called the fear index. This is the VIX index. And this is a volatility index. Technically speaking, is the stock volatility of option pricing, but let's leave it outside.
Could you explain a little bit how they come up with these numbers? Because in another webinar, Javier Santoma also referred to the VIX. And I got some questions back from people who had watched this on LinkedIn saying, what does this really mean? And how do they, who makes these numbers and do they mean anything, or are they conceptual?
Very good. So my MBA students were listening to me this morning, so that if somebody is online, they will listen to it twice. And sorry to bother you, but it's simple. These are not made up. This is data from financial markets. Where is it coming from? From options. We know that there are options being traded, financial options on Airbus, on Boeing, on Microsoft.
Options are when I agreed to I take an option to buy a stock sometime in the future.
Many CEOs, for instance, they have stock options given to them as compensation plans. So they have options to buy stocks of their company at an agreed price. And what's known from finance theory, and that actually gave a Nobel Prize to a few academics 10 years ago, was that volatility and option prices are related. And this means that we can actually look at option prices and see what's the volatility that people foresee into the future. So if I look at a certain option right now, I can foresee what is the implied, that's why it's called implied volatility, based on the current level of stock markets and option markets. This is what people see as their volatility into the future. So this is forward-looking volatility. That's important to highlight here.
And what we see here is a spike, and the last spike, I can't really see it because it was back in 2009, I guess.
Yeah, the last spike is back in 2009. Actually, a few days over the month of March, we went above the levels of 2009. So, but basically, let's say we're at the same level of volatility and perhaps even slightly higher from what was the worst financial crisis ever. And that basically wiped out 40% of banks worldwide and all, as we know, the 2008 financial crisis. And we have in this crisis, basically, this means there is fear. Right, there is fear, and the psychology. Everybody knows these funny stories about toilet paper, but I mean, the psychology is basically fear leads to herd behavior. So I don't want to miss out on opportunities. And if I see somebody buying toilet paper, I'm going to buy twice as much. I don't want to miss out. And here's a big pile of toilet paper I was able to grab for myself a few weeks ago. So I can trade.
You have all this toilet paper in your house. I mean,
I can trade. I bought it for all my colleagues. So whoever wants it, I have enough for all my colleagues.
Yeah. Now, just to make a clear comment to all of the people watching, I think we have 1,500 or something people watching this broadcast live on LinkedIn. The stores are full of toilet paper, so you do not have to buy toilet paper. It is not required. A friend of mine is actually the head of a factory making the little cardboard roll inside. They are full at capacity. They have plenty of stock. We are not going to run out of toilet paper, just in case anybody is thinking that we will. Now, Nuno, you published a report with estimates of what the economic impact of this whole thing will be, while most mainstream economists and the governors of the Bank of Spain and many people are saying it's not possible to make such projections. So how does a finance professor say, well, I'm going to ignore the economists. I'm going to make my projections because I think it's important. First question, why did you make such projections? And then maybe we'll get into the what those projections were.
Okay, Mike, interesting. So why? I mean, the why is very. I mean, I'll give you very, very, very simple. It's sometimes. I mean, sometimes I come up with ideas for research after seeing all things that are being discussed. I mean, this time was simply I listened to the projections of the main economic agencies worldwide, the IMF and the OECD, earlier in the month of March.
And they were very modest impacts, if I remember.
And they were saying something along the lines like the OECD was saying, and the IMF, the Concurred, was saying, look, the global growth for 2020, we used to forecast it at 3%. Now we think it's going to be 2.6. So there's going to be 0.4% shaved of global growth. And I said, come on, 0.4% after we know the major thing that's going on in China coming to Europe. How can you say this is like just small 0.4% of GDP disappearing? And then the other came along to what I think it was OECD first, and then 2 days later, IMF comes up with similar predictions from 2.9 to 2.4. I said, come on, that's not possible. So that's the why. Okay, I decided, okay, let me see if I can look at the data. Right, this is really a big data estimate. Let me look at the data that is available out there, and see if I can come up with some rational explanations that fit what we are observing right now, okay? And what we are observing based on, for instance, on Chinese data. We know that China is ahead of the West for at least 2 months from majority of countries, and we have data on China. So I use that data. We know data from companies that are releasing them in investor relations presentations. I use that data in the model as well. And these are typically data, live data, very real-time data that are not used in the majority of economic models by central banks.
Okay, so you weren't convinced by the numbers you were getting from these so-called, gold-plated sources. So you said you'll make your own with your own model and your own. What did you come up with?
Yeah, so basically the sources are basically everything I told you before, from companies' releases of data, Chinese data, and different things, compile them, and basically. Ultimately, economic growth, if I want to give you just a quick idea of what's behind, economic growth is an aggregate of what different people do in a country. Okay, that's very obvious, but it's good to highlight. So it doesn't come from somebody top-down approach, how much the economic growth is going to be. Even in China, when the government typically says we need 6% growth, it doesn't come top-down. Ultimately, somebody has to work to make this growth occur. And we know that the growth is asymmetric. We know that some sectors, as you were referring to before, restaurants and hotels, just to say a few, are being impacted in a lot in this crisis, okay? And some other sectors are not affected that much. I was talking to a good friend who is a CEO of a large agricultural firm this morning. He was telling me it's not affecting his business. He has more orders actually than ever in history. So, there are some sectors that are not terribly affected by this. There are some other sectors like hotels that are totally going to be shut down. And if it reaches to the summer, they're going to totally destroy a year of profitability. So there is a symmetry. What I want to say is this picture is showing you, for instance, tourism, how it's relevant in some countries more than others, like in Greece, Portugal, are super reliant on tourism, okay? That accounts for like 20, 25%, more than 20%.
Greece is the first one of those bars, because some people are watching this on their phone, so we have to be very clear for those people. Greece is the first one, which has a big percentage of its GDP on tourism, and the last one, I think, on the charts is Poland, if I see it correctly.
Yes. So in this chart, it goes from, so it says what's the importance of tourism and tourism in the different countries as a percentage of GDPs, and goes from what you said, 20% in Greece or Portugal to maybe 5% in the Netherlands, okay, or Poland. So on the right-hand side, you have Poland, Russia, Netherlands, and then on the left-hand side, you have Greece, Portugal, Mexico, Spain. And these are basically countries that rely a lot on tourism. Okay? And so the point is, this is one of the data that I use in my model. Right? Is how important is tourism in different countries, and we know already. We have data. Okay, we know that whole fleets of A380 are grounded. Right, so there is no single A380 flying right now. So what does it mean? Well, passenger levels are going down, occupation rates at hotels are going down dramatically. Many hotels are totally closed, and layoffs are being considered. So we know that tourism is affected a lot. So we know we have data from different sectors. And so what is the model ultimately doing is picking up all this data, looking at the countries' different compositions. Some countries are more exposed to tourism, some more to agriculture, some more to utilities, some more to telecoms. And so based on that, you can see different economic impacts around the world.
Got it. Nuno, before you jump to the projections, I just want to remind the people watching, if you type in questions on the chat, we have people from our Alumni Association who will magically get those questions to appear on my iPad here in my house, and we'll be able to ask those questions to the degree we can in the last part of the broadcast. So Nuno, what did you come up with? We're dying to know the numbers.
Okay, so I'll hold you just one moment to give you a more concrete answer, even to your last question on how to do it. I mean, the model basically, there's one thing that is impossible to predict, at least for me, is impossible to predict, which is how long these big containment measures are going to last, because this is ultimately a government policy, right? This is being done by decree, and we know many countries around the world, by decree, they implemented state of emergency, and they have police and army on the streets policing the country. So the length is uncertain. Of course, depends on the medical evolution and the epidemics. That is uncertain, at least to me, and I think to many experts, is also uncertain. So that is something
here in Spain we have the police, but not the army. We're in what they call a state of alarm, which is one level below the state of emergency. But yes, different countries are doing different things.
And so that is something I work with in the model using some scenarios, and I'll be clear about the scenarios later on. Then besides that, as I explained, the model uses lots of data that is available from China, different sectors. Openness to trade is also something I forgot to mention that is important, because we know that trade flows and basically supply chains have been affected a lot by this current coronavirus crisis. And so the fact that you're reliant on international supply chains makes it worse for some countries than for other countries. The values I'm going to show you are just for 12 countries, okay? That's what I could do in the time I had available, and when I released the first version of this model now almost 10 days ago. I think I released it on the 22nd of March. I will release a version 2. Okay, so I'm gathering data for, and the 12 countries I'm going to show it to you. It shouldn't be surprising, are kind of the G7 countries, top 7 countries in the world, plus some countries that I'm really fond of. One of them is Portugal, where I come from. The other one is Spain, and I'll show you that data in a second. But more countries are being added as we speak, and I've been working on that. Adding more data into the model will be released this week in version 2.0. For instance, other countries in Europe, smaller countries I have not added before, like Ireland or the Netherlands or Belgium or Switzerland, the Nordic countries, and some countries in other parts of the world. So, but now I'm going to show you results for 12 countries. These results only account for part of the economic impact. So I think these results may underestimate the true economic impact, because there are a couple of important things I don't consider in the model, because I simply couldn't figure out a way to.
Don't worry. I think if you don't show us the numbers, we're going to have an explosion here on LinkedIn. The comments are saying, "Come on, get to the point."
All right, so here's the point. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. Okay, before the point, I have to hold it for. I'm going to give you scenarios, scenarios. And the first scenario is what I call a mild scenario. What's a mild scenario? Is when the duration of the current crisis is going to end by the end of April. Okay, so this is basically assuming a 1.5 months of significant lockdown of economic activity, or sometimes it's shut down totally, sometimes it depends on the sector, as I said before. Agriculture doesn't stop completely, hotels, they stop completely because it's forbidden to go to hotels right now. So depending, that's 1.5 months, that's the scenario I have here, okay? And you see the economic impact is really in percentage of GDP. For instance, the first row is Brazil. So here the countries are alphabetically ordered. It says the economic impact is 3%. What does this mean? It means that according to my estimates, Brazil is going to lose 3% of GDP this year because of this, and it's a permanent loss. Okay, that's a question I get asked a lot, which is, I mean, is this going to be recovered next year? No, it's not. I mean, the fact that you did not go to your hairdresser, or that you didn't go out for the restaurant, or you're not going to eat 4 times.
You're not going to cut your hair twice in
You're
September.
You're not going to do that, nor will you buy 2 cars next year. No, I mean, no. So no, and so Brazil 3%, and then there is a confidence margin in all this. And you see Brazil, you see Canada 2.9, and the most affected ones in this table are basically Greece and Portugal at 4.6%. Okay, this is
and Nuno, just to understand it. So if the estimate for economic growth in whatever country, let's say Brazil, was about 3% this year, what you're saying is this year will be no growth.
Exactly. So let's take, for instance, a country that was forecasted to grow 6%, okay, which was China. China earlier this year was forecasted to grow 6%. There was huge consensus by different analysts that China in 2020 was going to grow 6%. I take that and I don't challenge that. That's kind of pre-crisis estimates. I take them, I accept them, fine. Pre-crisis, this was the estimate. Now I estimate what is the crisis economic impact. And so China was supposed to grow 6%. it has an economic cost of -3, so the overall growth in China is still going to be positive by roughly 3%. In Portugal, okay, to go to another extreme, Portugal was supposed to grow 1%. Now it's going to see a value destruction of 4%. So the GDP is going to contract by 3% in Portugal. And that's what I show you in this figure 10 of my report, which shows estimated total GDP growth for each one of the 12 countries. And it goes from, I mean, you can see the numbers, but top one over there is China, whose economic growth under this mild scenario would be 2.6% into 2020. And then Italy, for instance, would go down 3.2%. Italy is more here in the middle. Then you have US to the right. The US would be at 0.8%. Italy at 3.2, as I said, Portugal at 2.9, Spain at 2.1.
And so Nuno, in if I understand it properly, Wuhan, which is in Hubei province, which is a province of some 35 million people, kind of the size of a European country, to kind of put it in perspective, and that province was shut down for about 1.5 months. I understand that the subway has started to run again. The schools are opening next week. So if the whole world operates like Wuhan and Hubei, you're saying we might look at something like this.
Yeah. That's more or less.
But of course, we could be shut down longer, and that's your difficult scenario.
Definitely, and that would be kind of the my scenario 3, which I have there, which is basically a scenario where the shutdown of economic activity lasts until July. Okay, and this is 4.5 months, so starting in March until July. If that happens, we're now looking at a range of all countries. The first thing I want to highlight is that in the mild scenario, which was the one I showed you before, which is a 1.5 months, you still see economic growth in China, and almost all the rest of the world is going to go down. But if it lasts until the summer, all countries around the world will see their GDP fall, some more than others, so the asymmetry is still going to be here. But you see falls from sometimes bigger than 10% of GDP in some areas of the world. On average, it's around 7%, if I'm not mistaken.
Now, these estimates are significantly worse than most of what we'll see anywhere. And even in this series of webinars, most of our colleagues on the faculty have been relatively, I don't want to say upbeat, because there's nothing to be upbeat about. This is a terrible crisis, but relatively, confident that in 1, 2, or 3 months, the world will get back to some semblance of normal. If really we're shut down for 4.5 months and we lose 10% of the economy, the world normal goes out the window.
Totally. I mean, if this happens, this scenario, we're facing the worst economic crisis in the last 200 years, Mike. So this is really something super serious. Then if you ask what is going to be the implication of this in a sector A, B, or C, or then it's going to be very difficult to answer, because it's going to be the worst crisis in 200 years, right? So we know it's going to be very bad. No one is going to get away, right? It can be in the middle, right? So I showed you basically, that's something that I cannot forecast, and I hope somebody can, but I cannot definitely, which if it goes, I think this is really a minimum, okay, which I call the mild scenario. I don't think, now we see that the shutdown is forecasted in many countries, including Spain, to last until the beginning of May, end of April. So this is kind of the minimum. And then what I forecasted is that for each month that we continue with tough control measures costs about 2.5% of global GDP. So that's basically, if you want a policy variable, each additional month that we postpone the recovery, because hopefully one day the recovery will start and we have a D-Day. But each month this is postponed costs us 2.5% of GDP.
Now, Nuno, you mentioned public policy. We have lots and lots of questions and comments about public policy. The governments of the world are taking action. The United States Congress just passed a massive relief bill. There's a lot of things being said by different governments around the world. Are they? I mean, clearly they have access to similar models, and they're aware of this. Will they? What do you think they're thinking about? Do you think the policies they're putting in place are the right ones? Do you think they will keep the world shut down? Because if you talk about the worst economic crisis in 200 years, we're almost better off with a scary healthcare crisis. the governor of New York said, okay, we're going to fix the healthcare crisis and then we'll deal with the economic crisis. But if it's economic Armageddon, then maybe there's a different choice from a policy point of view.
Yeah, and that's that's really a discussion that I would not like to go into, which is a discussion between lives and economy. Okay, I don't think it's a healthy discussion. I think it's really what we're seeing here, and this is just a map that shows the confirmed cases worldwide. I mean, as I said before, it's a global crisis, but it's affecting some countries more than others. Okay, and also I'll show later the age of the population is important. So older countries are more affected than younger countries.
Right.
And I mean, but when we put, and that's where the big, let's say, health debate is going in the scientific area for doctors is this really serious or not when you compare it to a regular flu? And the answer, I mean, to be honest, I don't know. I've been reading scientists telling me, I thought my science, economics and finance was kind of shady because you have people saying government should spend, government shouldn't spend, and they're both economists. But now I'm finding out that even in hard sciences, like we don't have accurate statistics. So that's the first thing that is bothering me a lot is we don't know what's the mortality of this. So it's difficult to know what's the mortality. It's difficult to know what's the incidence this has. So therefore it's very difficult to assess what's the ultimate health cost of this crisis. And that's the first thing I want to say about governments, right? Very few governments are actually thinking carefully about economic policy with accurate data. They're shooting all over the place. This fear that I told you about before comes up also in government policy. So they're going one after the other. In Europe, you could clearly see that the packages that were being discussed by different governments, okay, 1 week was 10, the other week was 50, the other week was 200, and every week they would multiply them by 4 after the neighbor also multiplied it. So the lack of coordination between countries, in particular within Europe, is very worrisome for me. The lack of available data to take policy decisions is very worrisome for me. This is the first thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, by the way, before you continue, Nuno, we did do a session like this. We did a session with Magda Rosenmuller. It's online. You can look at it at the LinkedIn site. You can also look at it at IESE.edu, where she talks a little bit about the virality and a little bit about the way you have to look at the statistics.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for highlighting that.
So Nuno, if you can kind of summarize a little bit, because we have lots and lots of questions, and I want to make sure we get to some of these questions before we run out of time. What does your heart tell you? Are we looking at such a terrible future, or does your heart tell you that okay, it's a model, but maybe it's not going to be so bad? I mean, where do you sit? And you know, they've got this nice picture from one of your children behind you. You know, after looking at all this data, are you gloom and doom? Are you somewhat optimistic? Or are you just sensibly concerned?
Mike, I tend to be an optimistic by nature, but this time I'm trying to be realistic, right? And I think realistically speaking, we're going to see a fall of GDP at least of 3% worldwide. This fall is going to be larger the longer the current shutdown lasts. And governments effectively, although we can ask governments to do a lot for us, they have they wasted lots of the policy tools during the good years. So now it's very difficult for governments to use all their firepower because it was exhausted. Okay, so for instance, you can see now on the slide debt level. Okay, so we basically doubled the amount of debt worldwide. So this is the overall amount of debt. You can see it used to be around 40-50% of GDP. Now it's around 80. Some countries in Europe, many countries have debt levels above 100% of GDP. So when you have such a high debt level, it's difficult for you now to come to the rescue and help your citizens because it's difficult for you to find the money to do so. Some other countries, they have huge cash piles and they have accumulated money in past years, for instance, in sovereign wealth funds that they can now use to boost their economy and save their citizens. But it's very uneven, right? And I'm seeing in Europe, and that's something that is worrying me a lot, is a potential problem which is coming back to the last crisis in which we saw basically CDS spreads, which are risks of countries. And we had the big sovereign crisis back in 2011, 2012, where basically Italy, Greece, Spain, and Portugal were under attack. I'm seeing now the same thing happening, right? And we're seeing basically news saying the EU leaders clash over the coronavirus response, both from a medical point of view and from a health point of view and from an economic point of view. So
Nuno, one of our people watching asks, is this going to be the breakup of the EU? Is this going to destroy the EU?
I think it's one possible outcome of this. Very unfortunate that can happen if we don't have a good understanding at European level until July, right? As I told you, I mean, July for me is, if we get to July with a destruction of 10% of world GDP, I think we're really in Armageddon. And what happens next, I don't know. But I think it's going to be clear that some countries will be more affected than others. And if in 2011, because of the sovereign crisis, we already had the ideas that the euro would disappear, I think in 2020, we know that some countries wanted to exit the European Union. We had the UK just left the European Union a couple of months ago. And that's something that if I have to bet, if we don't get to an agreement over the next decade, many other countries will leave the European Union. And we're already starting to see the problems, right? Which is the South countries, basically the countries that are seen as more risky from a financial market point of view, are already under attack from the financial markets. And this shows you that the lack of solidarity at the European level is not really there. And it's true, governments can print money, but it's really a big challenge right now that I see is we already had this discussion, which is the protectionism.
And if we go beyond the borders of Europe a little bit, and you had Brazil, I think, is in your model. If we look at the developing world, and there's a few different questions asking about different things in different ways, but agrarian societies, societies where people walk, where people don't have any bank accounts, where people go to the crowded markets to get to do everything. What do you think the impact will be there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the new normal will show itself in different ways, right? And one way is we know that this is a crisis that impacts age differently, right? Although people, and there are unfortunately deaths from people, young people and old people, we know that the probability that you die, it goes up with your age. And so if you look at the countries around the world, some countries are just older than others. So this is going to affect some countries more than others. And in Africa, for instance, very young in general, it's a very young continent overall. This is even if it gets there super strong, it's not going to be so dramatic as, for instance, in Italy, which has a very old population. So summary, okay, outside Europe, this is the big danger I see, is that we go back really to big protectionism. We were seeing the trends already happening, and I think this is an additional boost to the trend of protectionism, threats to world trade, and basically going back to local economic models.
Digitalization, other changes which we might see as we come across this. There's a whole bunch of questions. I mean, will blockchain, replace monetary policy? Will companies become more digital? Let's imagine we're coming out of this thing now, and kind of what do you think are the 3 or 4 big changes that we'll see?
Yeah, I mean, I think, difficult if I would need to give you a couple of those.
I didn't warn you about this question. These are coming from the audience, not from me. Huh?
Sure. No, I appreciate it. And it's a very fair question, but I mean, I'm going to give you an opinion which is totally uninformed. What's the new normal, right? But I think there will be a new normal, okay, which is we're getting used to lots of things that many of us didn't know before. Right now, we know that some people are just doing video calls as before in their companies, before they used to travel to meet with the managers from their own company, and now they're meeting virtually using technology. Maybe out of the 10 monthly meetings every year, they will shift, and some of them will start to be virtual. So I know the future of work, that was something that was being debated. I think it's going to change. The transformation, digital transformation, if it was something that was not clear for some managers, I think now is super clear, the impact of digital. And as I say, I mean, what I would finally recommend, okay, is you need to focus as a manager, and I need to also leave with some positive outlook for all our viewers, focus on what you can control, right? I think probably I was too negative with governments, but I think governments still have a role to play, both in helping liquidity in SMEs or to support families that are in financial distress, because we may enter into big social unrest if this goes on for a few more months, and governments need definitely to make sure this doesn't happen. But then you as a manager, you need to focus on what you can control. And I mean, the fact that we are all sitting at home doesn't mean we are on holidays, that we can relax or just we can, for instance, a few things. Revisit your business model, right? Agility is more essential than ever. contacting people is easier now than ever. I mean, I've been trying to contact people for many months now, difficult agendas, and now it's easy, right? Now it's very easy to contact and get into the agendas of many of your international contacts. So ultimately, prepare for a D-Day. Okay, don't stress just about the outcome today. That's negative. It's a negative outcome. I think we cannot avoid. There is going to be a destruction in wealth. We're going to be poorer. Okay, it's a shock. We're going to be poorer after this, but you need to prepare yourself and your company for the D-Day.
Yeah, your colleague Javier Santoma, in another one of these series, which again is online, he had 8 steps for the CFO of a company, and part of that was, make sure you have enough cash to restart your business when the emergency is over.
Yeah, I mean, this can take different fashions. One is if you think about liquidity positions, but in general, even the business model of the company, right? What we were discussing about the new normal, supply chains. Okay, something we didn't touch upon here, but in some other webinars, I know
we did one of those yesterday.
Yeah. So the just in time. I mean, many companies are rethinking suppliers and all that. I know. So that's something that that's part of the business model rethinking. And some companies prefer to have more resilience. Some companies prefer to have more efficiency, and that's a trade-off that I think many people should think about revisiting right now.
Nuno Fernandes, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon and for your report. I think we're all going to look forward to 2.0. Personally, I hope it's going to be a little bit more optimistic, just because I like to think that the glass is half full. But so it goes. Remember that this session is recorded. You can watch it on LinkedIn, and it'll be there forever, just like the others. You can also watch it on IESE.edu and on some other sites around the world. Thursday at April 2nd at the same time, which is 4 p.m. Here in Barcelona, 10 a.m. in New York, and 10 p.m. in Shanghai. Thursday, we'll be talking with Anne-Louise Royce. She's from our Managing People division, talking about human resources and kind of what the HR director or the CEO needs to think about in terms of managing the people in these terrible times. For our part, thank you very much for tuning in. Please be safe, be well, and God bless.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.